Sure. Yeah. It's one of those things you'd only do once in every 7 years. Very good.
Rabbi, is there a mazel tov?
What's that?
Is there a mazel tov?
Sorry, I can't hear you. Could you speak up? Sorry.
Is there a mazel tov coming to you?
Oh yes, we had a granddaughter. My son and daughter-in-law in Israel had a daughter. Thank you. Yesterday morning, right after Shir, they called me. Thank you. Okay. All right. Sif Lamed Aleph. Misha nistapek lo im lava mechavera. So this is actually a quite important halacha, which could actually have very significant practical applications. I'm not sure if I borrowed money from my friend. I'm not sure if I owe somebody money. But my friend says, you definitely do owe me the money. In other words, I don't know, and he says, I know for sure. So halachically, I may be able to wiggle out of my obligation, but from a standpoint of a heavenly perspective, I have an obligation to pay him. Afal pi, even though shepator b'dinei adam, even though I'm exempt from the laws of man, because the laws of man, bari v'shema, even though normally we say bari v'shema, bari adif, that if a person says definitively you owe and the other one says I don't know, he can definitely exempt himself because he's essentially saying, I don't admit, but I don't deny either. Okay, so we'll see that in the commentary. V'im tovo b'safek pater af latzeis yedei shamayim. But if the plaintiff makes a speculative claim, he also says, I'm not sure if you owe me the money or not. So then I don't have to pay him even from a heavenly standpoint. So once again, Reuven says to Shimon, you definitely owe me $100. Shimon says, I'm not so sure. So because Reuven is certain, then even though this cannot be litigated in Beis Din, nonetheless, Shimon has a heavenly obligation to pay Reuven what he says he's 100% certain. If Reuven's not sure whether Shimon owes him the $100, and Shimon is not sure, then Shimon should feel no obligation whatsoever. However, let's qualify that further. Ve'im yadua lo shalava mimenu. But if Shimon knows, I did at one time borrow money from him, O shenis chayev lo michov acher, or I owe him money for some other reason. But ve'eno yodeya im parao, I just don't remember whether I paid you for what I owe you, whether it's a loan or whether it's some other kind of debt. Maybe, I'm not sure whether we ever settled on the gas money that we were supposed to split when you gave me a ride. Did I ever pay you? And he says, I don't know. I don't remember if you paid me or not. So if I know for a fact that at one time I had incurred a debt, and I'm not sure if I paid you for it or not, so then chayev latzeis yedei shamayim u'lashalem. I have an obligation, a heavenly obligation, to compensate you. In other words, because in a situation where he just says, I'm not sure if you owe me money, and you're also not sure, but you have no reason to suspect that you ever did owe him money, then you have no heavenly obligation to pay. But in this situation where you know that at one point you did owe him money and you just don't remember whether you paid him back or not, So then your heavenly obligation would be to pay him, even when neither party knows. That's right. Afal pi she'eino tovo klal, even if Ruvain doesn't put forth a claim at all. Even if Ruvain is just, sitting next to you in shul and you go up to him and say, do you remember if I ever paid you for that, for that kiddush that we said we were going to go halvesies on? I remember you sent the shul the money. Did I ever pay you for that? And the guy says, I don't know. I just paid the bill in the shul. I don't remember if you paid me or not. So then, Yedei Shamayim, you have to pay. Okay? Afal Pisheno Tovaklal, even if he's not, he's not claiming the money. V'im halo meshiv lo vadai she'ein chachayev li harei machalo. If, however, the guy sitting next to you in shul says, don't worry about it. You don't need to pay it. I took care of it. Don't worry. Maybe you did pay me. Maybe you didn't pay me. But I'm fine. I'm fine without it. You don't have to pay me. So then he's moichel. Upater afim yadu lo shu chayav lo adayin. And then you're pater to pay him, even if you discover that you definitely do owe him the money. In other words, you go back, you go through your bank statement, and you realize you never sent him that bank transfer that you said you were going to send him. You know for sure you didn't. But the fact that he says, you know what, don't worry about it. I took care of it. So then you don't have to pay. You may still feel that you would like to pay him, because if you made a pledge that you were going to pay him, you want to make good on the pledge, but you have no obligation whatsoever. Okay. All right, so that's the halacha. We've seen a number of different categories. Let me just go over the different.
That last point, though.
Yeah.
The guy might not have been working you if you said you knew you owe me money. It's only because you said you don't know what you did. So when you discover later, would he have been as forgiving if you said, I owe you the money, you want me to pay you now? He might not have said, don't worry about it. Only because.
Is it only because you don't know? Maybe he does know that you never paid him.
Right.
He says, don't worry about it. I took care of it.
It's just a question. I mean, I'm not sure. Like, I'm just saying, if someone owed me money and they said they can't remember where they paid and I don't remember, I might say, forget about it. If they come to me and say, I know I owe you money, but you still want me to pay, I might be more likely to say, well, yeah, if you know you owe me money, then pay.
Uh-huh. I hear your point. I hear your point. I think your point
You have
is
to
a
go
valid
back to them and say, I've discovered now, you still owe him.
It could be. It could be. Let's take a look. There's a lot of commentary on this sif. It's a very, very practical halacha. Right. What I'd like to do, though.
You get older as well.
Yeah.
You don't remember.
That's right. I'd like to review the different levels. There's at least, I think, 4 statements in this halacha. First of all, case number 1, Ruvain says to Shimon, you owe me money. You owe me $100. And Shimon says, like, I do? When did this happen? And Ruvain says, remember this, da, 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 and you never paid me, or never paid me back. And Shimon says, listen, if you know for sure, okay. So that's case number 1. That's not litigatable in a beis din, but you have a heavenly obligation to pay him if he says, yes, for sure, you owe me the money. Case number 2 is Ruvain says to Shimon, I'm not sure if you owe me, I'm not sure if you ever paid me what you owe me. And Shimon says, I'm not sure either. So then, that case number 2, Shimon has no obligation even from a heavenly point of view. Because since neither party is sure what's going on, there's no real claim. So you don't have an obligation to pay him back. Case number 3 is when you remember that you borrowed money from him or that you incurred a debt to him and you don't know whether you paid him. So then you have a heavenly obligation. So the difference between, so case number one is when Ruvain, the plaintiff, says you owe me the money definitively. Case number two is where neither party is sure. Ruvain doesn't know, Shimon doesn't know. And case number three is where Shimon and Ruvain both don't know, but Shimon remembers that at one time he did owe money. He just doesn't remember whether he paid it or not. So then you have an obligation to pay. Yeah, right. Okay. And then case number four is where Ruvain, the plaintiff, or the person, the creditor, says, "Nah, you don't owe me any money," or you can don't worry about it. And Shimon remembers that he borrowed money from Ruvain, or he knows that he incurred a debt, and Ruvain says, "Don't worry about it. You don't owe me anything. We're good." And Shimon doesn't remember if he paid him back. So then, even if Shimon later discovers that he didn't pay back, he has no heavenly obligation. So those are the four cases. Okay? Four different scenarios. Now we're going to go back to the commentary. Let's go to the Imrei Yaakov. V'chaveru tovo bari. And Ruvain, the plaintiff, says, "I know for sure that you owe me the money. Aval im chaveru eno tovo bari, pater lotses af yedei shamayim." But if Ruvain himself is unsure, he says, "I just don't remember whether you paid me back or not." And Shimon says, "I don't remember either." There's no heaven, or Shimon doesn't know if he owes him money at all, so Shimon is exempt. But in the third case, Shimon remembers for sure that he did incur a debt to Ruvain, right? Rakeni Yodea Impar, he just doesn't know if he paid it back. Then Shimon has an obligation to pay it back, even if Ruvain doesn't claim anything against him. Even if Ruvain is just sitting quietly next to him in shul, Shimon remembers he had committed to pay for half that kiddush, and he doesn't remember whether he did. So, Lotses Yedei Shamayim, you have an obligation to fulfill your heavenly obligation. Kaven de chavero tivao bibari, velo eno bari sheno chayev lo. This is the scenario, the first scenario, where Ruvain says, "You definitely owe me $100. Shimon says, "I just don't know whether I owe you anything." The imtafas hatoveya mafkinun mine. And now, in this kind of scenario, if Ruvain were to grab money from me and say, "I'm taking this as a debt," then Shimon would be able to take him to Beis Din and say, "I never admitted that I owe you money. Just because you know that I owe you money, you have no right to take my money." So, and Shimon would be right. Mishum de'ein tfisa mo'eles b'davar she'ein lo zchus ela b'im hanitva b'alatzeis yidei shamayim. So he says, Shimon therefore only has a heavenly obligation. You can't force Shimon to pay. You can't take forcibly his money from him. V'yesh omrim demol tfisa. There is an opinion, however, that says that if Ruvain forcibly grabs the money from him, then b'di'eved Shimon has no recourse, because Ruvain says, "I know for a fact that he owes me the money." Because then you have to extract it back from him. So there's a machlokes whether, if Ruvain forcibly just confiscates the money, does Shimon have a right to litigate and take it back? But one thing is clear: Shimon has a heavenly obligation to pay him back, even though the Beis Din cannot force him to. Okay? Now, even though you're exempt b'dinei adam, even though Shimon really is exempt from, it's not litigatable, it's not something that Reuven can take him to Beis Din for, because Shimon simply doesn't know. There is a rabbinic vow that is imposed, not nowadays, but up until recently, the Beis Din would impose an oath and swear Shimon that you really don't know. And if you shouldn't, you have to swear that you really don't know, because you might just be saying that to get him off your back. Okay? She'im lokain batalta shvuas eses, the Yomer Hanitva Eini Yodea v'yipater. He says, because if that were not the case, then a person could always weasel out of having to take a shvua by simply saying, I don't. Yeah, that just by saying, I don't know. Elavadai kishem shekofer bevadai nishbahesis, kachim omer Eini Yodea nishbahesis. He says, therefore, this rabbinic institution of a shvuas eses, where anytime a person claims that he doesn't owe money, he has to take a vow rabbinically to bolster his denial. The same thing is true over here. I'm not denying, I just don't remember that also we force you to take a rabbinic oath. And in this halacha, it makes no difference how Reuven claims the debt was incurred, whether it was incurred through a loan, or whether Reuven left something with him and he just never got it back, or whether Reuven is claiming that Shimon stole from him, or had made a commitment to him that he was going to pay something and just never made good on it. V'im tovo b'safek pater aflotze sidei shamayim ayin mashakasafti le'el le'inyan safek gezel. So he says, see what I refer you to what I have written above, when a person is not sure whether he's committed an act of theft or not. And that's all the way back in Seif Siman Zion. Let me just see if I can bring that up really quickly. Just give me 1 second. I just have to bring up the file. Unless you want to just see, maybe I'll just bring this up. Let me see what it is. This is too late. Yeah, if you don't mind just bringing it over for just 1 second, Barry. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So he says in the Likutim, he addresses the issue. He says, Safek gezel mutter min haTorah, hagam dechol safek deoraisa me haTorah lechumra hacha galikra mi baal devarim yigash. He says, if a person is not sure whether he's stolen or not, and the claimant is not sure whether he's stolen or not, the Torah exempts the defendant from having to pay when there's a question of whether he stole the money or not. The hamotzi mechavero olav haraya, because we have a principle that anytime a plaintiff wishes to extract money, he must bring proof. It's not just enough to suggest that I am owed money. The kachaya hamitzvah the halav shelo sigzol the dafka begezel vaday, aval gezel safek in hu biyadcha in kan iser gezel. And if a person just says, I don't know whether you have something of mine that is in your possession, then the kach halacha nemra hamotz mechavel avaray umisha tafas yochel lahachzik ve'in kan safek iser klal v'chemodelo asra Torah safek mamzer u'maiser safek kach afilu lotze sidei shamayim ein kan chashash. He says basically we utilize the principle of hamotz mechavero olav haraya to that whenever there's a question of transferring money from my pocket to someone else's pocket, the other party has the burden of proof. And therefore, if he just says definitively, I know you owe me this money, that's not enough. He has the burden of proof. And therefore, if a person is not sure, and I'm not sure, so then there's not even a heavenly obligation to obligate someone where there's no certainty whatsoever on either side.
Not only because Shimon doesn't even remember owing money.
Right.
But
No,
if he remembers all the money and can't remember what he paid, then we say he has a Shemayim obligation.
that's right. So that was case number 3. Here, it's where Reuven says to Shimon, a group of us got together and we decided that we were going to sponsor Kiddush in honor of our friend, or that we all decided we were going to get together and send dinner over to so-and-so. And I don't remember whether you had expressed the desire to chip in or not. And Shimon says, I also don't remember whether I expressed the desire to chip in or not. So in that situation, Shimon should feel no halachic obligation whatsoever to participate. Okay, so that's case 2. If Shimon remembers that he had said, yes, I'm going to be a part of it, and he doesn't remember whether he paid, that's case number 3. To be Yotzei Yedei Shamayim, he has to pay. He may be getting benefit, but if he never made that commitment and it was just an innocent mistake that his friend said, oh, Shimon is one of the participants in this gift,
That's part of Reuven's mistake.
then that was Reuven's error and it wasn't Shimon's error. And it is permissible for Shimon to go back to the recipient of the gift and say, it was very nice of you to send me a thank you card, but I did not participate in this gift, which is awkward, right?
He's not obligated.
I think he might be obligated. I'm not sure. That's a very good question, because the gift recipient may now feel a sense of indebtedness to him, which is incorrect.
That's how Reuven can extract money.
Yeah, it certainly
Right,
creates.
Reuven go to the recipient and say Shimon participated, and now all of a sudden Shimon has to participate, even though.
Well, he feels an obligation to participate. Right? It does create an awkward situation. Anyway, okay. Chayev Lotzeis.
Level of complexity on top of level.
Yeah. So Chayev Lotzeis Yedei Shamayim. This is case number 3, where Shimon knows that at one time he did commit a debt to Reuven, and he just doesn't know whether he's paid it back or not, and nor does Reuven know. So then in that case, he should fulfill his heavenly duty and pay it back. Das hataz dezed davke hecha shahamal v'toin achar kach borili shelo hechzartali. So the Taz has a chiddush. The Taz says that this is only if later on initially says, I have no idea. But then later he goes back and checks his records and he sees that Shimon never paid him back. The whole ve'ikr hoda'aso shel halo ve'ba'al yedei atzmo pater midinei adam v'rak bidei shamayim chayav. He says, and the reason is that since the whole question arose, here Reuven didn't even ask him for anything. The whole question arose in Shimon's mind, and Shimon then says, I think I do owe you the money. So then he only has a heavenly obligation, does not have a human being obligation. In other words, you're not obligated from a Beis Din standpoint to pay back a debt unless Reuven asks you to pay it back. Okay? Aval imgam hamalva misupakim paro olo bazeh pater af lotzeis yedei shamayim. So this is the Taz's opinion. He says that even if Reuven says, I have no idea whether you owe me the money or not, and Shimon says, I remember that I had a debt and I just don't remember whether I paid it, the Taz is of the opinion that you don't even have a heavenly obligation to pay it back. Aval, but that's not how the Rav Shulchan Aruch is paskening. He says, and he here quotes the Tumim, Cholek alavu svirle, Degamim hamalva misupak mikol mokom chayv lotzeis yedei shamayim va'ayin lekaman. The Tumim and apparently the Rav Shulchan Aruch as well says no. You know that at one time you did owe him money. Neither of you know whether you've paid back that debt that you know at some point did occur. So then you have a heavenly obligation to pay it back. So it's a machlokas, but the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and he says, and we're going to address this later on, and the Rav Shulchan Aruch says you do have an obligation. Yedei Shamayim. Ayin Imrei Yaakov le'el Simon Chesif Katan Yud Aleph Gedr Chiyuv Shamayim. Isha Kana Aliyah B'Veisak. So he says, I refer you back. We spoke about what the parameters of to fulfill your heavenly obligation. Misha Kana Aliyah B'Veisak Knesses. Let's say a person buys an Aliyah in shul. Okay, like we said, I pledged to sponsor a kiddush or whatever, right? He says, and you don't remember whether you paid your pledge. The gam hagoiva mistapek, and the shul has no record of it either. In other words, the shul doesn't know whether you've made the pledge or not. Chayev l'shalem misafek. I should post this halacha. Yeah, you have to pay back if you don't know, and the shul doesn't know. In other words, let's say you gave the gabbai, you told the gabbai verbally, or the paper clip fell off, and now you have no idea. Did I pledge to give something for an aliyah? Yeah. Here you know you pledged. Here you know you pledged for the aliyah. You just don't remember what it was, how much it was, or whether. Yeah. How can you pay then if you don't know how much it was?
I thought you remember how much it was. You just don't remember whether you paid.
Well, here the simpler case is you don't remember whether you paid it. You know that you pledged for it. But it seems to me that if you don't even know how much you paid, then you'd have to come up with a figure that you would say, reasonably, this is what I would normally pledge. You have to pay it. Okay. So this case number 3 that we saw, where both sides don't know, just that Shimon remembers at one time he did owe money. So then, afal pi she'eino tovo klal. So you have a heavenly obligation to pay back Ruvain, even if Ruvain never even asks you for the money. Aval im tovo bevadai, she'omer manali biyadcha bevadai, v'hanitva omer nachon shahayu lecha biyadi, aval eini yodei im atzarti lecha olo, chayev l'shalim gam b'dinei adam. Now here's a corollary of that, and that is that let's say Ruvain says, I lent you $100, you never paid me back. Shimon says, I remember borrowing the money from you, and I'm not sure if I paid you back or not. Are you sure I didn't pay you? And he says, yes. I'm not so sure that I didn't pay you. Are you sure I didn't pay you? So there, because Reuven says, I know you never paid me, and Shimon says, I'm not sure. I know that I borrowed, but I'm not sure if I ever paid you. So then that's even litigatable. Shimon has not only a moral obligation to pay back Reuven, but Reuven can even take him to Beis Din for that. Kevin devadai nischayev lo v'safek im hechzer lo v'chiyai gavna amrinan bori v'shema bori adav. He says, because since Shimon acknowledges that at one time he did owe him the money, and he's not sure whether he paid him back or not, that's the classic case of the Gemara of bori v'shema bori adav, where the claimant says, for sure you owe me. The defendant says, I don't know, but I do know that one time I did borrow or I did owe you, and I don't remember whether I've made good on that. That's where the Gemara says that Shimon has to pay. Vimlo tavo adam ela me'atzma omer lechavero hilvisani ve'ina yodeya im echzarti lach the pater midinei adam. So our case over here is where no one is making a claim against Shimon. And Shimon of his own volition, you know what, we'll hold it here because it's already late. So yes, we're going to start learning at 6 a.m. starting Monday. And what I'll do is I'll send out a WhatsApp. Have a great